Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where the dust never settles and legends are forged in gunpowder and grit. Tonight, pull up a seat by the campfire, pour yourself a cup of black coffee, and listen to a story of the raw and untamed West, a tale of a lone woman against a tide of savagery, a fight for a home that became a war for a soul. This is the story of the widow's last stand, a deadly fight to defend her home. The wind on the high plains of late 19th century Wyoming had a voice all its own. It wasn't the gentle whisper that rustled through aspen groves, but a mournful howl that swept down from the jagged peaks of the Bighorn Mountains, carrying the scent of pine, dust, and the coming winter. For Ann Whitmore, it was a constant companion, a perpetual reminder of the vast and tamed wilderness that stretched out in every direction from her small, isolated homestead. For the past year, since the day she had buried her husband, Thomas, on the gentle slope of the hill overlooking their modest log cabin, the wind's song had been one of profound loneliness. The cabin, built from the sturdy lodgepole pines Thomas and she had felled and hewn themselves, stood as a solitary bulwark against the elements. It was more than a shelter, it was a testament to their shared dream, a dream that had been shattered by the very lawlessness for which the frontier was famed. Thomas, a man whose gentle nature was as expansive as the land he had come to love, had been cut down by a stray bullet during a botched stagecoach robbery on the trail to Cheyenne. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a cruel twist of fate that had left him a widow at 28, the sole proprietor of 160 acres of unforgiving, albeit beautiful, land. The silence that followed his death was a physical entity, a heavy blanket that smothered the small cabin. In the beginning, it had been unbearable. She would wake in the night, her heart pounding, certain she had heard his heavy footfall on the porch or the low rumble of his voice. But there was only the wind and the creak of the cooling timbers. The silence was in the empty chair across the small, scrubbed pine table, in the unused tools that hung in perfect order in the small barn, in the vast, empty space beside her in their rope bed. But Ann was not a woman given to despair. Grief had carved new lines around her startlingly blue eyes and had thinned her lips into a determined slash, but it had not broken her. It had, instead, forged a new kind of strength within her, a quiet and yielding resilience as hard and enduring as the granite bedrock that lay just beneath the thin topsoil of their land. She was a daughter of the frontier, born and raised in a sod house in Nebraska, and she understood its harsh calculus: you either bent to its will, or you were broken by it. Thomas had been the dreamer, the one who saw poetry in the vast, star-dusted sky and promise in the unbroken earth. And had always been the pragmatist, the one who knew how many cords of wood were needed for winter, how to stretch their supplies, and how to sight down the barrel of a rifle. Her father had taught her to shoot, insisting his only child know how to handle a firearm as well as any man. "This land don't care if you're a man or a woman, Annie," he would say, his voice rough as burlap. "It only cares if you're quick or you're dead." She had taken the lesson to heart. Her Winchester 73, a gift from Thomas on their first wedding anniversary, was not a wall decoration, it was an extension of her own arm. She could hit a running jackrabbit at 75 yards and reload with a fluid grace that was almost hypnotic. Thomas had marveled at her skill, though he had prayed she would never have to use it for anything other than putting meat on their table. Now, the rifle leaned against the wall by the hearth, its brass receiver gleaming in the firelight, a cold comfort in the encroaching twilight. Her days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. She rose before dawn, the chill of the cabin air sharp against her skin, and began the endless cycle of chores. She milked their lone cow, fed the chickens, tended the small vegetable garden she had fiercely protected from pests and the punishing sun. She mended fences, chopped wood, and maintained the small but vital irrigation ditch that Thomas had ingeniously dug from the creek a half-mile away. The physical labor was grueling, leaving her muscles aching and her hands calloused, but she welcomed it. It was a balm for her sorrow, a way to keep the crushing weight of memory at bay. In the exhaustion of her body, she found a sliver of peace for her soul. The homestead was isolated, a tiny speck of human endeavor in a vast, indifferent landscape. Their nearest neighbors, the Svensons, were a good 5 miles to the east, and the rough-and-tumble settlement of dusty streets and false-fronted buildings that called itself Progress was a full day's ride to the south. In the early days, after Thomas's death, a few of the townsfolk and neighboring ranchers had ridden out to offer condolences and help. Mrs. Svensson, a stout woman with a heart as big as her frame, had brought food and sat within 4 hours, her silent presence a comforting anchor. A rancher named Jedediah Kane, a man with a weathered face and kind eyes, had offered to buy her out. "It's no place for a woman alone, Mrs. Whitmore," he had said, his hat clutched respectfully in his hands. "This is hard country. It takes more than one pair of hands to make a go of it," and had thanked him for his concern, her voice polite but firm. "This is my home, Mr. Kane. Thomas and I built it. His sweat and blood are in this soil. I'm not leaving." He hadn't pressed the issue, but she saw the doubt in his eyes, the same doubt she saw in the eyes of the shopkeepers in progress when she rode in for supplies. They saw a lone woman, a vulnerability, a tragedy waiting to happen. They didn't see the steel in her spine or the cold resolve that had taken root in her heart. This land, this home, was all she had left of Thomas. To abandon it would be to abandon his memory, to concede defeat not just to the land, but to the violence that had taken him from her. And Ann Whitmore would not be defeated. As autumn began to paint the cottonwoods along the creek in brilliant strokes of gold and orange, a new kind of chill began to settle over the prairie, one that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. It came in the form of whispers and rumors, carried on the wind like the seeds of a noxious weed. They spoke of a gang of outlaws, a pack of human wolves led by a man known only as Silas Kane. They were said to be more brutal, more rapacious than the usual bands of road agents and rustlers that plagued the territory. Stories trickled into progress of ranches burned, of families terrorized, of men left dead for the slightest provocation. They weren't just thieves, they were harbingers of chaos, moving across the land with a swaggering impunity that suggested they feared neither God nor the law. And heard the stories during her infrequent trips to town, listening quietly from the corner of the general store as men spoke in low, worried tones. The sheriff in progress, a man named Miller who was more politician than lawman, offered platitudes and promises of increased patrols. But everyone knew his authority barely extended past the town limits. Out here, in the vast, empty spaces between settlements, a person was on their own. The law was what you could enforce with the gun in your hand. One crisp October afternoon, as she was riding the perimeter of her property, checking for breaks in the fence line, she found the first tangible sign that the distant threat was drawing closer. It was the carcass of a steer, one of her own, identifiable by the simple W brand on its flank. It hadn't been killed by a wolf or a mountain lion. The animal had been shot, the meat crudely butchered, with large portions left to rot under the unforgiving sun. It was a wasteful, arrogant act. But it was what she found nearby that sent a cold spike of fear through her gut. In the soft earth near the carcass were the hoof prints of several shod horses and the distinct impression of men's boots. And beside them, ground into the dirt, was a spent cigarillo, thicker and more aromatic than the cheap cheroots the local cowboys smoked. It was a small detail, but it spoke of a careless disregard, a confidence that they could take what they wanted without consequence. They had been on her land. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The abstract fear she had heard in the hushed conversations in town had now become a concrete and terrifying reality. They had crossed her property line. They had killed her livestock. They were close. That night, the silence of the cabin felt different. It was no longer the quiet of loneliness, but the taut, listening silence of a hunted animal. Every gust of wind against the shutters sounded like a footstep. Every skittering sound from the roof could be a hand seeking a grip. She sat at the table for hours, the Winchester lying across her lap, its polished stock smooth and cool beneath her trembling fingers. The fire in the hearth cast long, dancing shadows that played tricks on her eyes, turning familiar shapes into monstrous forms. She thought of leaving, of heeding Jedediah Kane's advice. The thought was a tempting whisper in the dark, a siren song of safety and ease. She could sell the homestead, take the money, and go back east, to a place where the law was more than just a word and neighbors were a shout away, not a 5-mile ride. She could leave the hardship, the loneliness, and the fear behind. But then her eyes fell upon the mantelpiece above the hearth. There sat a single, framed photograph, its silver tarnishing at the edges. It was of her and Thomas, taken on their wedding day. He was looking at her, a wide, guileless smile on his face, his eyes full of love and a future that had been stolen from them. She was looking at the camera, a younger, softer version of herself, a hint of a smile on her lips, her hand resting trustingly in his. Looking at that photograph, the whispers of retreat died in her throat, choked by a rising tide of fierce, protective anger. This was their home. They had poured their youth, their strength, and their dreams into this unforgiving soil. Every log in the cabin, every furrow in the small field, every stone in the foundation of the barn was a piece of their shared life. To run would be to let the shadows win. It would be to let the brutal, lawless men who had created this world of violence take the last thing she had of him. She stood up, her movements suddenly decisive. The trembling in her hands had ceased, replaced by a cold, steady purpose. She walked to the window and stared out into the vast, moon-drenched darkness. The prairie was silent, a silvered sea under the immense sky. It looked peaceful, but she knew better. It was a deceptive calm, the deep breath before the storm. They would come. She didn't know when, but she knew it as surely as she knew the sun would rise in the east. They had tasted what she had, and they would be back for more. They would see a lone woman, an easy target. They would see a well-tended homestead, a prize for the taking. Let them come. She was no longer just a grieving widow. She was the guardian of a legacy, the keeper of a dream. She was Anne Whitmore, and this was her home. And she would defend it to the last bullet, to the last breath. The silence of the prairie was over. The quiet before the battle had begun. The first light of dawn found Anne not in her bed, but on her porch, the Winchester held loosely in her arms, her eyes scanning the horizon. The fear of the previous night had not dissipated with the darkness, it had instead solidified into a cold, hard certainty. They would be back. The wasteful slaughter of her steer was not the act of hungry men, it was a message, a territorial marking by predators. She was living on borrowed time, and the price of that loan was her vigilance. Her first thought, a practical and deeply ingrained instinct, was to seek help. The frontier ideal of rugged individualism was a fine thing in stories, but survival was often a communal affair. To believe she could face a band of seasoned outlaws entirely alone was a fool's errand. So, swallowing her pride and a piece of dry bread, she saddled her steady mare, Bess, and rode east, towards the Svensson place. The ride itself was a study in newfound paranoia. Every clump of sagebrush seemed to hold a crouched figure. The call of a hawk made her start, her hand instinctively go into the Colt Peacemaker, Thomas's pistol, which she now wore belted at her hip. The 5 miles to the Svenssons' homestead, a journey she had made countless times without a second thought, felt like 100 miles through enemy territory. She saw the land differently now. The rolling hills were no longer gentle swells of earth but potential ambush points. The rocky outcrops were snipers' nests. Her world had transformed from a home into a battlefield. She found Olaf Svensson mending a corral fence, his broad back to the trail. His wife, Helga, was wringing out laundry near their sod house, a structure built more into the earth than upon it. When they saw her approach, their faces, usually wreathed in welcoming smiles, were etched with concern. "Anne, is everything all right?" Helga called, wiping her damp hands on her apron. Anne dismounted, her body stiff with tension. She explained what she had found: the butchered steer, the tracks, the sense of violation. As she spoke, she watched Olaf's face. The friendly, crinkled lines around his eyes tightened. He stopped his work, his gaze drifting warily towards the west, towards her land. "Silas Kane's men," he muttered, the name leaving his lips like a curse. "They have been hitting the ranches north of here. We heard talk in progress. They were on my land," Olaf, and said, her voice low and steady. "They will be back. I came to ask for help. If they come, I can't hold them off alone." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the snap of the wind against Helga's laundry line. Helga looked at her husband, her expression pleading. Olaf stared at the ground, his big hands clenching and unclenching round his hammer. He was a good man, a decent man, but he was not a fighter. He was a farmer who had come to this land to build a peaceful life for his wife and their 3 young children, who were now peeking from behind the door of the soddy. "And," he began, his voice thick with an anguish that was almost as painful to her as a flat refusal. "What can we do? I have a rifle, yes, but I am no gunman. To fight them it would be suicide. They would burn us out. They would Helga, the children." He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "We will pray for you," and Helga said, her eyes welling with tears. We will pray for God's protection. And nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She had expected it, but the reality of their fear, so palpable and justified, was a blow nonetheless. They were not abandoning her out of malice, but out of a desperate, primal need to protect their own. She could not fault them for it. "I understand," she said, her voice betraying none of her disappointment. "You must look to your family." She turned to leave, 5 miles back to her homestead now seeming an impassable gulf of isolation. Her next stop was Progress. The town was a half-day's ride, and she pushed Bess harder than she liked. If her neighbors could not help, the law must. The thought was a frail hope, but it was all she had. Progress was its usual chaotic self-miasma of dust, manure, and the tinny sound of a piano from the saloon. She tied Bess in front of the sheriff's office and walked in, the jingle of her spurs and a naturally loud sound in the quiet room. Sheriff Miller was a portly man with a florid face and a carefully waxed mustache that seemed to be the focus of most of his energy. He was leaning back in his chair, his boots propped on his desk, reading a day-old newspaper from Cheyenne. He looked at her over the top of the paper, his expression one of mild annoyance at being disturbed. Once again, and told her story. She kept her tone even and factual, detailing the evidence. Miller listened, his fingers steepled under his chin, his expression unchanging. When she finished, he sighed a long, theatrical exhalation of breath. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice oozing a patronizing sympathy. "I understand your concern. Truly, I do. A lone woman like yourself, it's natural to be jumpy. But a dead steer is hardly evidence of a coming war. It was the way it was killed, and insisted. The wastefulness of it. And the talk. Everyone knows Kane's gang is in this territory. Talk is cheap, ma'am. I can't dispatch my deputy to a theme in a wild goose chase every time a rancher loses a head of cattle. My jurisdiction is this town. The county is vast. I have to prioritize." He leaned forward, his chair groaning in protest. "My best advice to you is the same I'd give any sensible person in your position. Sell up. Move into town, or better yet, head back east where things are more civilized. This is no country for a woman to manage on her own." The dismissiveness in his tone, the smug certainty of his words, ignited a fire in Anne's belly that burned hotter than her fear. She had not come here for advice on real estate. She had come for the law. And she had found only a man in a tin star badge more interested in his own comfort than in the safety of the citizens he was sworn to protect. "I am not leaving my home, Sheriff," she said, her voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "And I did not come here to be told I'm jumpy. I came to report a crime and a credible threat. If you are unwilling to do your duty, then just say so." Miller's face flushed a deep red. He swung his feet off the desk and stood up, trying to use his bulk to intimidate her. "Now you listen here, Mrs. Whitmore. I won't be spoken to in that tone. You're upset, and I'll make allowances for that. But you have no proof of anything other than some poor luck with a cow. When you have a real crime to report, you come and see me. Until then, I suggest you go on home." And stared at him for a long moment, the contempt she felt a bitter taste in her mouth. She saw him for what he was, a coward hiding behind a badge, a symbol of the very lawlessness he was meant to fight. She turned without another word and walked out, the door slamming shut behind her with a satisfying crack. The ride home was filled with a chilling clarity. The Svenson's fear, Sheriff Miller's apathy were two sides of the same coin. No one was coming to help her. The social contract of the frontier, the unspoken promise of mutual protection, had proven to be as flimsy as a wisp of smoke. She was utterly and completely on her own. As her cabin came into view, a small, defiant shape against the vast emptiness of the plains, her despair began to recede, replaced by something harder and more potent, rage. A cold, calculating fury. If the world would not protect her, then she would protect herself. If the law was a sham, she would become her own law. This cabin, this land, was her sovereign nation, and she was its sole defender. She spent the remainder of the day and the next in a fever of activity, her grief and fear channeled into methodical preparation. Her first task was to take a complete inventory of her arsenal. There was the Winchester 73, her primary weapon. It was reliable, accurate, and she knew its every quirk. Then there was the Colt Peacemaker, a 6-shooter that was more of a last-ditch weapon. And finally, stored in a heavy wooden chest, was Thomas's old 12-gauge shotgun. It was a brutal, close-quarters weapon, and she dragged it out, cleaning the barrels until they shone. Her ammunition was limited. She counted the rounds carefully, 94 for the Winchester, 30 for the Colt, and a little over 40 shotgun shells, half of them loaded with rock salt, the other half with deadly buckshot. It was not a lot. Every shot would have to count. Next, she turned her attention to the cabin itself. It was sturdy, but it was a home, not a fortress. She had to change that. She spent hours dragging heavy furniture, a big oak wardrobe, the chest of drawers, Thomas's heavy reading chair, and positioning them against the walls, creating secondary barriers inside. She boarded up the back window completely, leaving only the front window and two smaller side windows as outlooks. On these, she didn't nail the boards shut. Instead, she drilled small peepholes and hinged the heavy shutters so they could be barred from the inside but opened just enough to create firing ports. Her work then moved outside. She knew she couldn't stop them from reaching the cabin, but she could make their approach as difficult and costly as possible. She walked every inch of the cleared land around her cabin, her mind working like a trapper's. She saw the natural dips in the terrain, the placement of every rock and bush, not as features of a landscape, but as tactical elements. Her first trap was simple, designed for noise. She gathered all the empty tin cans she had and strung them together with twine, creating a series of crude but effective alarms along the most likely paths of approach from the barn to the house. A man moving in the dark, no matter how carefully, would be hard-pressed to avoid them. Her second trap was more malicious. There was a section of the wooden walkway leading to the porch that had always been a little weak. She spent an hour in the small root cellar beneath the cabin, carefully sawing through the supporting beam from below, weakening it just enough so that it would hold her weight, but not that of a heavier man moving with purpose. Below, in the dark, cool earth of the cellar, she embedded the tines of an old pitchfork, points upward. It was a gruesome thought, but sentimentality was a luxury she could no longer afford. The barn was her biggest vulnerability. They would likely go for it first, to try and burn her out. Inside, in the hayloft, she set up her most ambitious and dangerous trap. Using a complex system of ropes and pulleys that Thomas had built for hoisting hay, she positioned a massive, sharpened log directly above the main doors. She rigged a tripwire across the entrance, so that anyone forcing the doors open would release the catch, sending the deadfall crashing down. It was a one-time use trap, but if it worked, it would be devastating. As she worked, her hands ran, her body screaming with exhaustion. Her mind was a whirlwind of memories. She remembered Thomas teaching her how to sight the Winchester, his large, gentle hands guiding hers. "Steady now, Annie. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." She remembered her father's stern lessons. "Never point a gun at anything you ain't willing to destroy." The lessons of the two most important men in her life, one a creator, the other a survivor, merged within her. To honor the creator, she had to become the survivor. By the end of the second day, the transformation was complete. The cozy homestead was gone. In its place stood a fortified redoubt. The windows were dark, shuttered eyes. The ground around it was seeded with unseen dangers. The interior was a barricaded warren, and stood on the porch as the sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows across the plains. She was no longer just a widow. She was the commander of a fortress of one, and she was ready for war. The wind picked up, howling its mournful song, but for the first time in a year, it didn't sound like loneliness. It sounded like a battle cry. 3 days passed. The silence that descended upon the homestead was heavier and more fraught with tension than any she had ever known. It was not the silence of peace, but the hell breath of anticipation, and slept in short, fitful bursts, fully clothed in her chair by the hearth, the Winchester cradled in her lap. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her system. She ate little, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety. She patrolled her small fortress, moving from one shuttered window to the next, peering through the firing slits at the empty landscape. The world had shrunk to the size of her 160 acres, and the only thing that existed beyond it was a faceless, encroaching threat. The attack, when it came, did not begin with a thunder of hooves or a volley of gunshots. It began subtly, on the afternoon of the fourth day. She was scanning the eastern approach when she saw them, 3 riders, moving at a slow, almost casual pace. They weren't riding hard like a posse or a raiding party. They were ambling, their posture relaxed, as if they were simply out for a leisurely survey of the land. But Anne knew better. Their casualness was a performance, a form of psychological warfare. They wanted her to see them. They wanted her to know they were here. She watched from the window, her heart a trip hammer against her ribs. They were still a half-mile out, but she could make out their shapes. They were rough men, dressed in a motley collection of worn leather and dust-caked denim. One of them, a big, bearded man on a powerful roan, seemed to be the leader. He gestured with a sweep of his arm, and the three of them fanned out, beginning a slow, circling patrol of her property line, always staying just out of effective rifle range. This was a probe, a test. They were sizing her up, examining the layout of her defenses, looking for weaknesses. They were supremely confident, moving with the lazy arrogance of apex predators who have scented prey and are in no hurry to make the kill. The hours crawled by. The sun beat down, and the three riders continued their slow, relentless circle. They never spoke, never shouted, their silence more unnerving than any threat, and stayed behind her fortifications, her discipline absolute. She did not fire a warning shot. She did not show herself. To do so would be to give them information, to betray her position and her nerve. She simply watched, her breathing shallow, her finger resting lightly on the trigger guard of the Winchester. She was a spider in her web, and she would wait for the flies to come to her. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple, they made their move. They converged and rode directly towards the cabin, their pace still and hurried. They stopped about 100 yards out, just beyond the barn. The big, bearded man dismounted. "Hello, the house," he called out, his voice a gravelly boom that carried easily in the still air. "We're just some weary travelers, ma'am, looking for a little water for our horses and maybe a bite to eat. We'd be much obliged." It was a lie, so blatant and contemptuous that it made Anne's blood run cold. They weren't travelers, they were wolves testing the strength of the sheepfold's door. She remained silent, her rifle stock pressed hard against her shoulder, the front sight centered on the man's chest. "Ain't no need to be shy, little lady," a second man, a weary fellow with a weasel-like face, chimed in with a laugh. "We know you're in there. We know you're all alone. Silas just wants to make your acquaintance." The name slashing in the air, a confirmation of her worst fears. These were Cain's men. The game was over. The bearded man took a few steps forward. "Now, we can do this easy, or we can do this hard. The choice is yours. All we want is a little hospitality. You open that door, and no one gets hurt." Anne's mind raced. They were trying to draw her out, to get her to open the door. She remained silent, her world narrowed to the small circle of the rifle's sight. The man's patience finally snapped. The mask of civility dropped, revealing the raw brutality beneath. "All right, have it your way, bitch," he roared. He turned to his companions. "Jed, you and Slim circle round back. See if you can't find an easier way in. I'm gonna go check the barn. Maybe we'll just burn her out." As the two smaller men spurred their horses and began to circle the cabin in opposite directions, the bearded leader strode confidently towards the barn. This was the moment Anne had planned for. He was heading directly for her deadfall trap. She held her breath, praying the mechanism would work. He reached the large barn doors and gave them a powerful shove. They groaned open. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a sound of splintering wood and a whir of rope, the massive log she had positioned in the hayloft was released. It fell with sickening speed, crashing down directly where the man had been standing a moment before. A scream of pure agony tore through the evening air, followed by a wet, crunching sound. The two circling riders reined in their horses, their heads whipping round towards the barn, and didn't wait. As the weasel-faced man Slim stared in shock, she tracked him with her Winchester, leading him just slightly. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, its report a deafening crack in the twilight. Slim was thrown from his saddle as if punched by an invisible giant, a dark stain blossoming on his shoulder. His horse shrieked and bolted into the darkness. The third rider, Jed, reacted instantly, spurring his horse towards a rocky outcrop, firing his pistol wildly in the direction of the cabin. Bullets splintered the logs near her window, showering her with tiny shards of wood. And ducked back, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and fierce, primal triumph. The trap had worked. She had hit her target. She moved to another firing port, her movements practiced and sure. The wounded man, Slim, was trying to crawl towards the same rocks Jed was using for cover. He was leaving a dark trail in the dust. The man at the barn was silent, either dead or grievously injured. "You're gonna die in there, you hear me?" Jed screamed from behind the rocks, his voice shrill with rage and fear. "Silas is gonna hear about this. He's gonna skin you alive." And ignored him. Her focus was on the immediate threat. She reloaded the Winchester, the metallic click of the cartridge being chambered a final, definitive sound. She had crossed the line. There was no going back. The thought didn't frighten her. It settled her. She had a choice to make. She could try to pick off Jed from behind his cover, a difficult shot in the fading light. Or she could deal with the wounded man. A cold, hard pragmatism took over. A wounded man was a liability to his partner. He slowed them down. He was also a more certain target. She rested the barrel of the Winchester in the firing slit, took a deep, steadying breath, and aimed carefully at the crawling figure of Slim. She felt a pang of something, a flicker of humanity that recoiled at the cold-bloodedness of what she was about to do. He was a man, a human being. But then she thought of Thomas, lying dead on a dusty road. She thought of the slaughtered steer, of Sheriff Miller's smirking face. The flicker of pity died, extinguished by a flood of icy resolve. These men were a plague, and she was the cure. She fired. The shot was true. Slim's body went limp. A guttural howl of fury erupted from behind the rocks. Jed fired his pistol empty in her direction, the shots going wide in his rage. Then there was a frantic scrambling sound, the thunder of hooves, and he was gone, riding hard into the night, disappearing into the vast darkness of the prairie. Silence descended once more, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was heavy, ringing, and smelled of gunpowder, and remained at the window for a long time, her rifle at the ready, her ears straining for any sound. But there was only the wind, whispering through the bullet holes in her cabin wall. Slowly, she lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she leaned against the wall, taking deep, shuddering breaths. She had done it. She had faced them, and she had won. At least, for now. She had taken human life. 2 of them. The reality of it crashed down upon her. It was one thing to practice, to plan. It was another to see a man fall by your own hand. But as the initial shock wore off, it was replaced by a grim satisfaction. They had come to her home expecting a frightened, helpless woman. They had found a killer. She had drawn a line in the dust with blood and gunpowder. She knew the writer, Jed, would go straight back to his master, Silas Kane. She had not ended the threat. She had merely announced the beginning of the war. Kane would come now, not with a small probing party, but with his entire gang. He would come for revenge. And pushed herself away from the wall, the trembling in her hands subsiding. There was work to do. There were bodies on her land. The night was long, and the true storm was yet to break. The moon rose, a cold, silver dollar in a black velvet sky, illuminating a scene of brutal stillness. For a full hour after Jed's frantic departure, and did not move from her position behind the shuttered window. She watched the 2 dark shapes lying motionless in the dust of her yard. Her senses stretched to their breaking point. It could be a trick. Jed could be circling back. There could be others, hidden in the darkness. But the prairie remained silent, save for the mournful cry of a distant coyote. Finally, driven by a grim necessity, she unbarred the door. The heavy shotgun was in her hands now, its twin muzzles seeming to swallow the moonlight. She moved with a predator's caution, her back to the cabin wall, stepping over the threshold into the night air that was thick with the coppery scent of blood. Her first stop was the man called Slim. He lay face down, his lifeblood a dark, fretting pool in the pale dirt. She nudged him with the toe of her boot. There was no response. His pistol was still in its holster, and she took it, along with the cartridge belt around his waist. Every weapon, every bullet, was a resource she could not afford to waste. Her next destination was the barn. The great log lay amid the splintered remains of the doors. Pinned beneath it was the bearded man. One look was enough to tell her he was dead, his body crushed by the immense weight. His rifle lay a few feet from his outstretched hand, and she collected that as well. It was a Henry repeater, older than her Winchester but still a fine weapon. The act of stripping the bodies of their guns was a grim, dehumanizing business. It was something she had only read about in dime novels, the actions of soldiers or savages. Yet, here she was, under the cold Wyoming moon, performing the task with a detached efficiency that scared her. It was as if a part of her, the softer part that had mourned Thomas and tended her garden, had been cauterized and sealed off. In its place was a hard, functional core focused on one thing only: survival. Dragging the bodies was the worst part. They were heavy, inert sacks of flesh. The effort was immense, leaving her gasping for breath, her muscles straining. She couldn't leave them in the yard. The sight of them would be a grisly trophy for Cain when he returned, and the smell would soon become unbearable. With grim determination, she dragged them one by one to the far side of the barn, near the manure pile. There would be no Christian burial, no words spoken over a shallow grave. They were an infection, and she was merely disposing of the waste. The work took hours, and by the time she was done, the eastern sky was beginning to pale with the first hint of dawn. Exhausted, filthy, and emotionally numb, she retreated back into the sanctity of her cabin. She barred the door, washed the blood and grime from her hands in the basin, and forced herself to eat a piece of jerky and drink some water. She couldn't afford to let her strength fail. The following day was an exercise in pure dread. She knew Jed would have reached the main camp. She knew Cain would be gathering his men. The question was not if they would come, but when and how. Would it be a frontal assault in broad daylight? A stealthy attack under the cover of darkness? The uncertainty was a torment. She used the day to refine her defenses. She took the extra guns, Henry repeater and the 2 pistols, and created new firing stations. She placed one rifle at a side window, another at the front, so she could move between them, creating the illusion of more than one defender. She propped the heavy shotgun, loaded with buckshot, against the inside of the front door. If they managed to breach it, that would be their welcome. She also took stock of her most vital resources: water and food. She filled every bucket, pot, and container she owned with water from the well, knowing that leaving the cabin during a siege would be a death sentence. She gathered her canned goods, sacks of flour and beans, and jerky into a central pile in the middle of the main room, away from the walls where stray bullets might pierce them. The cabin was no longer a home in any sense of the word. It was a pillbox, a supply depot, a tomb in waiting. As she worked, the psychological toll of her isolation began to wear on her. The silence pressed in, and her mind started to play tricks. A gust of wind sounded like a whispered name. The shadow of a passing cloud was a line of approaching riders. The memories of Thomas became more vivid, more painful. She saw him everywhere: in the chair he had built, in the way the morning light hit the floorboards he had laid. That evening, she found herself talking to his photograph on the mantel. "They're coming, Thomas," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They're coming for our home. I killed 2 of them. I had to. I hope you understand." The image, of course, remained silent, his smile frozen in time. But in her heart, she felt not condemnation, but a fierce, phantom encouragement. He had loved this place, but he had loved her more. He would want her to live. And to live, she had to fight. The second night after the skirmish, it gave her a sign. She was dozing in her chair when a bright, flickering light from outside snapped her awake. She crept to a peephole and looked out. On the low ridge to the north, a massive bonfire had been lit, its flames leaping high into the night sky. She could just make out the dark silhouettes of men moving around it, their distant, drunken laughter and shouts carried to her on the wind. It was them, the entire gang. They were camped just out of rifle range, close enough to let her know they were there, to watch her, to lay siege to her nerves. It was a classic, cruel tactic. They weren't going to rush in. They were going to make her wait. They would let hunger, thirst, and fear do their work first. They would let her imagination populate the darkness with 1,000 horrors. They were turning her home into a pressure cooker, and they were content to sit by the fire and wait for it to explode. All through the night, the fire burned, and did not sleep. She watched the flames, a baleful orange eye staring at her from the darkness. She imagined them cleaning their guns, drinking whiskey, talking about what they would do to her when they finally took the cabin. The fear was a living thing inside her now, a cold, coiling serpent in her gut. But her resolve was a shield against it. Let them watch. Let them wait. Every hour she held out was an hour of defiance. Every breath she took was a small victory. The dawn of the third day broke, gray and somber. The fire on the ridge had died down, but she knew they were still there, hidden amongst the rocks and scrub. The waiting game had begun in earnest. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the small cabin. The air inside grew stuffy and hot. The silence was absolute. Late in the afternoon, the tension was broken. A single rider detached himself from the ridge and rode slowly towards the cabin. He carried a white cloth tied to a stick, a flag of truce. He stopped 100 yards out, the same spot where the bearded man had issued his threats, and watched him through her rifle's sights. He was tall and slender, dressed in black, with an air of theatrical authority about him. Even from this distance, she could feel the menace radiating from him like heat from a forge. It had to be him. Silas Kane. And Whitmore, his voice was not the brutish roar of his subordinate. It was cultured, almost gentle, yet it carried an unnerving resonance, a chilling lack of warmth. I am a reasonable man. My associates were trespassing, and you dealt with them. Harshly, I might add. You have proven your point. You are no helpless damsel. He paused, letting his words sink in. But now the game has changed. I have 20 men with me. They are not reasonable. They are thirsty for vengeance. I am, however, willing to offer you a chance to walk away from this with your life. Leave the cabin. Leave the weapons. Ride east and do not look back. My quarrel was with your husband's interference in my business. It is not with you. But this house, this land, it is now mine. A compensation for my lost men. Anne's hands tightened on her Winchester. The casual, proprietary way he spoke of her home, the insulting lie about Thomas, it all fueled her simmering rage. You have until sundown to decide, Mrs. Whitmore. Kane's voice drifted to her again. At sundown, my offer expires. And I assure you, when my men are done, the only thing left of this place will be ashes. The choice is yours. Life or death. Without waiting for a reply, he turned his horse and rode leisurely back to the ridge. The white flag fluttered mockingly in the breeze. The ultimatum hung in the hot, still air. Sundown. He had given her a deadline. The psychological pressure was immense. He was offering her an escape, a chance to live. All she had to do was give up everything Thomas had died for, everything she had just fought and killed for. She looked around the dim, barricaded room. It was dark and smelled of stale air and fear. But it was hers. It was the last bastion of her life with Thomas, the last physical piece of their dream. To surrender it to his murderer's associates was a betrayal she could not contemplate. To walk away would be a living death, forever haunted by the ghosts of her own cowardice. She walked to the mantel and picked up the photograph of her and Thomas. She looked at his smiling face, and in her heart, she made her decision. Death in a hail of bullets was better than a long life of shame. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in fiery streaks. The shadows of the cabin and the barn grew long, like skeletal fingers stretching across the land. From the ridge, she could now see them. The entire gang. They were mounted, rayed in a long, dark line against the bleeding horizon. They were not silhouettes anymore. They were 20 armed men, their faces turned towards her, their rifles and pistols glinting in the last rays of sunlight. The gathering storm was about to break. Anne moved to the front window, slid the Winchester's barrel through the firing port, and took her position. Her heart was strangely calm. The fear was gone, burned away by the white-hot certainty of her purpose. She was not going to die cowering in a corner. She would die on her feet, fighting for the one thing in the world she had left to love. She lined up her sights on the man in black at the center of the line. The sun touched the horizon. The battle for the Whitmore homestead was about to begin. The world seemed to hold its breath. The sun, a molten disk of copper, bled out across the horizon, and in its dying light, the line of 20 riders on the ridge was transformed into an assembly of vengeful specters. At their center sat Silas Kane, a figure of calm, dark authority. The time for words, for ultimatums, was over. Anne's world had shrunk to the V-notch of her Winchester's rear sight and the brass bead of the front. They were perfectly aligned on the center of Silas Kane's chest. Her finger was taut on the trigger, the first stage of pressure already applied. Her own breath was a silent, steady thing in her throat. She would not wait for them to begin. This was her home. She would fire the first and last shot in its defense. With a final, silent prayer to a god she wasn't sure was listening, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle's roar was a physical blow, a violent tearing of the profound silence. It was her answer, spoken in the universal language of lead and gunpowder. The shot was long, the light was failing, and she saw the bullet strike the dirt just in front of Kane's horse. The animal shied violently, but Kane, with masterful horsemanship, brought it under control. He had not been hit, but the message had been delivered. There would be no surrender. For a moment, the line of riders remained motionless, as if stunned by her sheer audacity. Then Kane raised a hand, and the world erupted. It was not a charge. It was a volley of disciplined fire. 20 rifles spoke as one, and the front of Anne's cabin was hammered by a hailstorm of lead. Wood splintered, sending sharp projectiles flying through the room. The window pane above her head, the last vestige of civilized life, shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. The sound was a deafening, continuous roar, a physical pressure that vibrated through the floorboards and into the bones of her feet. She ducked down, pressing her face against the rough log wall, tasting the dust of her own disintegrating home. This was Kane's strategy, not a reckless, chaotic assault, but a methodical dismantling of her defenses. He would tear her fortress apart from a distance, using his superior numbers and firepower to pin her down, to break her will before a single one of his men had to risk his life. But Anne's will was not so easily broken. The initial shock gave way to a cold, focused fury. As the first volley subsided, she was back at the firing port, the Winchester's barrel poking through. The riders had broken their line and were now fanning out, using the terrain for cover as they advanced. It was a classic pincer movement, designed to attack her from multiple angles at once. She saw two men dismount and begin a crawling advance towards the east side of the cabin, using a shallow ditch for cover. She drew a bead on the rearmost man, exhaled slowly, and fired. The man grunted and collapsed, clutching his leg. His partner hesitated, then began firing wildly in her direction to cover his wounded comrade. Bullets thudded into the logs around her, but Anne was already moving. She scurried, bent low, to the side window where she had placed the Henry repeater. From this new angle, she had a clear view of another pair of outlaws who were using the stone wellhead as cover to approach the front. She rested the Henry's barrel on the sill, and fired. The rifle, with its heavier caliber, kicked like a mule. One of the men cried out and staggered back, his arm hanging limp at his side. "She's on the side. The bitch is on the side," someone screamed. Their fire shifted, now concentrating on her new position. She ducked back as lead tore through the shutter, showering her again with splinters. She had achieved her first objective. She had created the illusion of movement, of more than one defender. They didn't know where the next shot was coming from. From the ridge, Kane's voice cut through the din of gunfire. "Burn her out. Get to the barn. Burn it down." It was the command she had been dreading. Her cabin was built of sturdy logs, slow to catch fire. But the barn, filled with dry hay and old timber, was a tinderbox. If they set it ablaze, the heat and light would expose her, bake her out of her shelter. 3 men broke from the main group and made a desperate, zigzagging run for the barn. This was a critical moment. She had to stop them. She ran back to the front window, ignoring the bullets that sang past the opening. She sighted on the lead runner, a big man who ran with a reckless, loping stride. She fired. He stumbled but kept going. She levered another round into the chamber, aimed again, and fired. This time he went down, tumbling head over heels into the dust just yards from the barn wall. The other 2 dove for cover behind a watering trough. They were pinned down, but they were perilously close to their target. The whole yard was now a killing field, crisscrossed with lines of fire. The air was thick with smoke, and the constant crackle of gunfire was punctuated by the ricochet of bullets off the stone foundation of her cabin. Then she heard a sound that chilled her to the bone, a heavy thud against the front porch, followed by the creak of floorboards. Someone was close, terrifyingly close. She abandoned the Winchester and grabbed the 12-gauge shotgun she had leaned against the door. It was heavy and awkward in her hands, the beast of a weapon. She crept towards the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She peered through a small peephole she had drilled. In the deepening gloom, she could see a figure pressed against the cabin wall, just to the side of the door. He was trying to stay in her blind spot, and he was standing directly on the section of the porch she had weakened. She saw another outlaw break cover and make a dash for the porch. This must be his partner. "Now, Cal," the running men shouted. "Kick it in." The man on the porch, Cal, took a step back to get a running start. He put his full weight onto the weakened planks. The crack of the supporting beam snapping was as loud as a gunshot. The planks gave way with a scream of tortured wood, and the man named Cal vanished with a cry of shock and agony. A sickening, wet tearing sound followed from the root cellar below. His partner, who had just reached the edge of the porch, skidded to a halt, his face a mask of horrified confusion. He stared down into the black hole where his friend had disappeared. That hesitation was all it needed. She yanked the heavy bar from the door, swung it open, and fired the shotgun. The blast was apocalyptic in the confines of the cabin. A deafening roar, a gout of flame and smoke. The load of buckshot hit the outlaw square in the chest, lifting him off his feet and slamming him back into the yard. He landed in a crumpled heap, silent and still, and didn't wait to admire her work. She slammed the door shut and dropped the heavy bar back into its brackets, her ears ringing, her shoulder aching from the recoil. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She leaned against the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The trap had worked. The shotgun had done its brutal job. From outside, the firing faltered. The sudden, shocking violence at the very door of the cabin had clearly unnerved them. She heard shouts, confused and angry. She had turned their assault into a bloody rout. "Fall back! To the ridge! Fall back!" It was Kane's voice, cold and sharp, cutting through the chaos. She scrambled back to the window, the Winchester once more in her hands. She saw them retreating, dragging their wounded. They were moving with a new caution, a new respect. They had come expecting to swarm a helpless widow. They had found themselves in a meat grinder. In the gathering darkness, she watched them go. The yard of her home was littered with the dark shapes of their dead. The siege had begun, and she had won the first battle. But as she looked at the splintered walls of her cabin and listened to the pained cries of the wounded men fading into the distance, she knew this was only the opening act. The storm had broken, but the night was far from over. Darkness fell completely, a thick, starless blanket that swallowed the prairie. The outlaws had retreated to their bonfire on the ridge, but their presence was a palpable weight, a promise of violence yet to come. The initial adrenaline of the battle drained out of Anne, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a trembling that she could not control. The silence that followed the firefight was somehow more terrifying than the noise. Her ears rang, and in the quiet, she could hear the drip of water from a bullet-pierced bucket and the low moan of the wind through the new holes in her home. The cabin, her sanctuary, felt violated, its walls scarred, and its air thick with the acrid smell of spent gunpowder. She knew she couldn't rest. The reprieve was temporary, a chance for both sides to regroup. Kane was no fool. He would not make the same mistake twice. The next assault would be different, more cunning. Her first priority was damage assessment. Using the dim light of a carefully shielded lantern, she moved through the cabin. The main room was a wreck. Splintered wood littered the floor, and a fine layer of dust covered everything. One of Thomas's books had been pierced clean through by a bullet. The sight sent a fresh pang of grief and rage through her. She checked her supplies. The water bucket was a loss, but the main barrel was untouched. Her food was safe. Her ammunition was another story. She gathered the spent cartridges, her fingers moving automatically, and counted her remaining rounds. She had fired more than 20 times. Her supply, which had seemed adequate just hours ago, was now alarmingly finite. Every missed shot was a step closer to her own death. Her most gruesome task was dealing with the man in the root cellar. Leaving him there was not an option. With a rope and a Herculean effort that strained every muscle in her body, she hauled his corpse out of the pit and dragged it outside, adding it to the grim collection by the barn. She then took the broken planks from the porch and nailed them crudely over the hole. Her fortress had a new, ugly scar. As she worked, the psychological war began. From the ridge, the taunts started, carried on the night wind. "You can't hide forever, widow. We're gonna have some fun with you when we get in there. Silas says to thank you. You're saving him the trouble of digging graves for these boys." Their voices were disembodied, demonic. They were trying to chip away at her sanity, to fill the silence with fear. She forced herself to ignore them, focusing on her tasks. She moved the Henry repeater to the boarded-up back window, creating a new firing position. She reloaded all the weapons, laying them out so she could grab any one of them in an instant. Hours passed. The bonfire on the ridge burned, a constant, knocking reminder of the pack of wolves waiting just beyond her door. Hunger gnawed at her, but she could only manage to chew on a piece of jerky. Her stomach was a cold, tight knot. Sleep was an impossible luxury. Around midnight, the next attack came. It wasn't a full-scale assault. It was quieter, more insidious. She heard a soft scraping sound from the roof. Her blood ran cold. They were trying to get in from above, to bypass her fortified doors and windows. She grabbed the Colt Peacemaker, its shorter barrel better suited for the close confines of the cabin. She looked up at the ceiling, a simple construction of logs and packed earth. Where would they come through? She moved to the center of the room, standing back to back with the hearth, trying to watch every direction at once. The scraping stopped. A new sound began, a soft, rhythmic chipping at the mud and sod between two of the roof logs. They were trying to create a hole. The sound was maddeningly slow, a deliberate torture. It was the sound of her tomb being unsealed. She had an idea. It was risky, but it was better than waiting to be shot from above. The fireplace. The chimney was wide, built of river stone and clay, a potential entry point but also a weapon. She grabbed a bundle of oil-soaked rags she had prepared for lighting lamps. With shaking hands, she shoved them onto the embers still glowing in the hearth. Then she began piling on green wood, the dampest pieces she could find from the woodbox. The effect was immediate. The fire didn't roar, it smoldered, producing a thick, acrid cloud of smoke. The smoke had nowhere to go but up the chimney. It billowed out into the room, making her eyes water and her lungs burn, but most of it was drawn up the flue. She crouched low to the floor, where the air was clearer, and waited, the Colt held in a two-handed grip, aimed at the ceiling. A choked gasp came from the roof, followed by a fit of violent coughing. "Smoke. He's trying to smoke us out," a voice rasped. There was a frantic scrambling, the sound of men sliding down the pitched roof. A dark shape tumbled past the front window and landed with a heavy thud in the yard. The chipping stopped. She had driven them off the roof. The cabin was filled with smoke, but she was safe, for now. She kicked the smoldering logs apart, and slowly, the air began to clear. But Cain was relentless. No sooner had one threat been neutralized than another appeared. A flicker of light caught her eye from the side window. She crept over and peered through a crack in the shutter. A man was crawling towards the cabin wall, a burning torch in his hand. In his other hand, he carried a flask. Coal oil. He was going to try and set the base of the logs on fire. She rested the barrel of the Winchester in the firing slit. The man was less than 20 yards away, his face illuminated by the torchlight. He had a look of intense, grim concentration. She felt no pity, no remorse. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet took him in the neck. He dropped the torch and the flask, his hands flying to the wound. The flask shattered, spilling oil that was instantly ignited by the fallen torch. For a terrifying moment, a wall of flame erupted near the cabin. But the man had fallen short of his target. The fire was burning on open ground, illuminating the yard in a ghastly, dancing light. And in that light, Anne saw something that made her heart stop. It was Jed, the man who had escaped the first night. He and another outlaw had been using the arsonist's advance as a distraction, and they were now sprinting for the dark side of the barn. She tracked them, firing twice. The shots were hurried. One went wide, and the other kicked up dirt near Jed's heels as he dove into the black shadow of the barn. He was inside her perimeter. The long night had just gotten longer. She was trapped in the cabin, and now at least one of her enemies was inside her second line of defense, hidden in the darkness of the barn, waiting for his chance. The fire in the yard slowly died down, plunging the world back into a thick, impenetrable blackness. The taunts from the ridge had stopped. They had been replaced by a heavy, watchful silence that was infinitely more menacing. The hours between the failed fire-raising and the first light of dawn were the most agonizing of Anne's life. The knowledge that Jed was in the barn, a viper in her nest, was a constant, grinding pressure on her nerves. She couldn't see him. She didn't know his plan. Was he alone? Was he waiting for reinforcements? Every gust of wind rattling the barn door sounded like him preparing to make a move, and spent the time in a state of hypervigilance, moving from window to window, her senses straining to pierce the oppressive darkness. She was a prisoner in her own home, surrounded with an enemy both outside the walls and within her compound. Exhaustion was a physical pain, a heavy weight on her shoulders. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep and the lingering smoke. Her body ached, but she knew that to give in to it, even for a moment, would be fatal. As the eastern sky began to soften from black to a bruised, sullen gray, she knew the final confrontation was at hand. Cain would not wait for another night. He had lost too many men. His pride was on the line. He would use the morning light to launch an attack that would end this one way or another. She made her preparations. She drank the last of the clean water from her canteen, ate a dry biscuit that tasted like sawdust, and methodically rechecked her weapons. She was down to fewer than 30 rounds for the Winchester and a handful for the other guns. The end of her ammunition was now a foreseeable event. The attack began not with a fusillade, but with a terrifying, new tactic. From the ridge, she saw a group of men pushing something before them. It was a heavy supply wagon, one they must have stolen from a nearby ranch. They had turned it on its side and were rolling it towards the cabin like a massive, wheeled shield. It was impervious to her rifle fire, a slow-moving Trojan horse that would allow them to get right up to her front door. Behind the wagon, the rest of the gang advanced, using it for cover, laying down a steady, suppressive fire that hammered the front of the cabin. Wood chips flew like shrapnel. The noise was constant, a physical assault designed to disorient her and keep her head down. And knew she couldn't stop the wagon. Her rifle bullets simply glanced off its thick oak frame. She had to do something drastic. The barn. Jed. She had to take the fight to him, to dislodge him before the main force reached her door. It was a desperate gamble. To leave the relative safety of the cabin was madness. But to stay was to be a cornered rat, waiting for the terriers to be led into the cage. Making a split-second decision, she ran to the back of the cabin. She had boarded up the window, but she had not barricaded the small back door that led to her vegetable garden. It was her escape hatch. Taking a deep breath, she unbarred it, slipped outside, and closed it softly behind her. The morning air was cold and sharp. She was exposed. She stayed low, using a stone retaining wall Thomas had built for her garden as cover, and crept towards the side of the barn. The main firefight was still concentrated on the front of the cabin, providing a deafening cover for her movements. She reached the side of the barn. There was a small door here, one she used for daily chores. It was slightly ajar. He was in there. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She holstered the Winchester on her back and drew the Colt Peacemaker. This would be close work. She eased the door open and slipped inside. The barn was dark and smelled of hay and animals and fear. Motes of dust danced in the thin shafts of gray light that pierced the gloom through knotholes and cracks. She stood perfectly still, letting her eyes adjust, her ears straining over the sound of her own ragged breathing. A floorboard creaked in the hayloft above. He was up there, waiting in ambush. He had the high ground. It was a perfect trap. She backed slowly out of the doorway, her mind racing. She couldn't go up the ladder. He'd shoot her before she was halfway up. Then she saw it. The rope and pulley system for the hayloft. The very same one that had supported her deadfall trap. A thick rope dangled down, its end tied off on a cleat on the main support beam. An idea, born of pure desperation, formed in her mind. She moved to the front of the barn, near the main doors that her trap had destroyed. She picked up a piece of splintered wood and threw it across the barn floor, against the far wall. "Come on out, you coward," Jed's voice snarled from the loft. "Had enough of hiding, have you?" He fired his pistol in the direction of the sound. The muzzle flash momentarily illuminated his position. He was near the edge of the loft, peering down. That was all she needed. While he was distracted, and ran to the support beam, and tied the heavy rope, and with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, began to pull. The big hay hook on the other end rose swiftly towards the rafters. She swung the rope like a pendulum, once, twice, aiming for the spot where she had seen him. The heavy iron hook swung up and over the edge of the loft. There was a startled cry of pain and surprise. Jed had been looking the other way. The hook had caught him, snagging his gun belt or his clothes. He was knocked off balance, and with a scream of terror, he tumbled over the edge. He fell hard, landing on his back with a sickening thud that drove the air from his lungs. His pistol skittered away into the hay, and was on him in an instant, the muzzle of her Colt pressed against his forehead. It was Jed, the rat-faced man who had ridden away and left his friends to die. His eyes were wide with shock and pain, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle from the fall. "Please," he wheezed, terror replacing the malice in his voice. "Don't." For a fleeting second, she hesitated. But then she heard a tremendous crash from the front of the cabin, followed by the triumphant roar of the outlaws. The wagon had reached the porch. The walls had been breached. They were coming in. She looked down at the man who had brought this storm upon her. There was no mercy left in her. "This is for Thomas," she said, and pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening inside the barn. She didn't wait to see the result. She snatched up Jed's pistol and ran for the side door. As she emerged, she saw that the front of her cabin was engulfed in flames. The outlaws had smashed through the front window and thrown torches inside. Her home, her fortress, was now a funeral pyre. She was trapped between the burning cabin and the remaining outlaws in the yard. They saw her, and a triumphant cry went up. She was wounded, a piece of shrapnel from the cabin's destruction having sliced a bloody gash in her arm. She was out of rifle ammunition, down to the last few rounds in her two pistols. Cornered, bleeding, and exhausted, she took cover behind the stone wellhead, the last defensible position she had. Silas Kane and half a dozen of his remaining men were advancing on her, their faces grim masks of victory. It was over. But as they closed in for the kill, and Whitmore raised her pistol for one last stand, she would not die begging. She would die fighting. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of fire, smoke, and thunder. The triumphant roar of the outlaws as they breached the cabin was a sound of finality, the howl of the wolf pack closing in on the last cornered lamb. Behind her, Anne's home, the repository of all her memories and dreams, was becoming an inferno. The heat was a physical blow, and the crackle of the devouring flames was a sound of heartbreaking loss. She was pinned behind the circular stone wall of the wellhead. Her arm throbbed, a hot, wet line of blood soaking her sleeve. She had two pistols, maybe 10 shots between them. Advancing on her were Silas Kane and 6 of his men, spreading out to surround her, their faces illuminated by the firelight, their expressions a mixture of grim satisfaction and bloodlust. "It's over, Mrs. Whitmore." Kane's voice was calm, almost conversational, a chilling counterpoint to the chaos. He stopped 20 yards away, a position of casual command. "You have cost me dearly. More than a dozen men. A great deal of time. But, I must admit, you provided a rather thrilling evening's entertainment." His men chuckled, a low, menacing sound. They moved slowly, deliberately, tightening the circle. They were savoring the moment, the final, inevitable victory, and said nothing. She pressed her back against the cold stones of the well, her breath coming in shallow, painful rasps. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but something else was rising to meet it, a pure, unadulterated defiance. They had taken everything from her. Her husband, her home, her peace. They would not take her dignity. She would not beg. She would not cry. She would make them pay for every last inch of ground. She raised both pistols, one in each hand, resting them on the stone rim of the well. The classic two-handed grip her father had taught her was impossible with her wounded arm. This was raw, desperate instinct. "Last chance to beg for a quick death," Kane said, a thin smile playing on his lips. "It would be a shame to let the boys have their fun after you've shown such spirit. Go to hell," and breathed, her voice a low, gravelly rasp. Kane's smile vanished. "So be it." He raised his pistol. "Take her." As his men raised their own weapons and opened fire. She didn't aim for Kane, he was too far, too central. She aimed for the men on the flanks. She fired the two pistols in a staggered rhythm, a desperate drumbeat of defiance. A man on the left screamed and clutched his shoulder, staggering back. Another on the right grunted and fell to one knee. They returned fire, a volley of shots that slammed into the wellhead, showering her with stone chips that stung her face and hands. She ducked low, the world a blur of muzzle flashes and the whine of ricocheting bullets. She was buying herself seconds, nothing more. Just as a tall outlaw broke from the group, charging forward with a knife in his hand. A new sound split the night. It was not the crack of a pistol or the roar of a shotgun. It was the deep, booming report of a buffalo rifle, fired from a great distance. The charging outlaw was lifted from his feet, a hole the size of a fist punched through his chest, and slammed to the ground. Every head, including Anne's, whipped around towards the east. On the low rise where the Svensson's property began, a line of dark figures on horseback had appeared, silhouetted against the pre-dawn glow. There were at least half a dozen of them. "What in God's name?" Kane snarled, his composure finally breaking. Another buffalo rifle shot boomed, and one of Kane's men near the burning cabin cried out and fell. A voice, strong and clear, carried across the prairie. "Silas Kane, this is Jedediah Kane. You and your men are on my neighbor's property. Lay down your arms or be shot where you stand." It was Kane, the rancher who had offered to buy her out. And beside him, his face pale but resolute in the firelight, was Olaf Svensson, holding a rifle with white-knuckled hands. The other riders were cowboys and ranchers, ordinary men roused to action. The smoke and the sound of the sustained battle had been a beacon, a signal of a war being waged in their midst. Kane's conscience, or perhaps his own sense of self-preservation, had won out. He had gathered his neighbors. For a moment, Kane's gang was frozen in confusion, caught in a deadly crossfire, and seized the opportunity. She rose from behind the well, her face a mask of grim fury, and fired her remaining shots at the stunned outlaws. Another man went down. The outlaws panicked. Their disciplined circle dissolved into a mad scramble for cover. The ranchers on the ridge opened fire, their shots methodical and accurate. It was a turkey shoot. Caught between a vengeful widow at close range and a line of angry ranchers with long guns, Kane's men were cut down. Silas Kane, however, was a survivor. Seeing his gang disintegrating, he turned not to fight the ranchers, but to finish the woman who had caused all of this. He charged directly at Anne, his face contorted in a mask of pure hatred, his pistol leveled. Anne's guns were empty. She threw one of the useless pistols at him as she fumbled for the spare she had taken from Jed. Kane fired. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of her shoulder, spinning her around with its impact. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded in her body. She fell to her knees, the world tilting crazily. Kane stood over her, his pistol aimed at her head, a triumphant, demonic leer on his face. "The bitch dies now," he hissed. But as he pulled the trigger, another shot rang out. Not from the ridge, but from much closer. Kane's eyes went wide with surprise. A small, dark hole appeared on his crisp black vest, just over his heart. He looked down at it, confused, then looked back at Anne. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a bloody gurgle came out. He staggered backward, his pistol falling from his lifeless fingers, and collapsed into the dust. Anne looked up, her vision swimming. Standing 20 feet away, smoke curling from the barrel of his rifle, was Olaf Svensson. He had left the ridge and crept forward during the chaos. The farmer, the man who had been too afraid to help, had just saved her life. The fighting was over. The last of Kane's men were either dead, wounded, or had fled into the darkness. Silence fell, broken only by the roar of the fire and the pained groans of the dying. And remained on her knees, the empty pistol clutched in her hand, watching as her home burned against the backdrop of the rising sun. She had won. The dawn broke fully, casting a pale, impartial light on a scene of utter devastation. The cabin was a roaring pyre, its roof collapsing inward with a great shower of sparks and a groan of dying timbers. The yard was a battlefield, littered with the bodies of the dead and the detritus of the fight. Jedediah Kane and the other ranchers rode down from the ridge, their faces grim. They moved with a quiet purpose, checking the bodies of the outlaws, their expressions a mixture of awe and horror at the carnage Anne had wrought. Olaf Svensson rushed to her side, his rifle forgotten, his face etched with a profound, soul-shaking guilt. "Anne, Mrs. Whitmore, are you hurt?" Before she could answer, his wife Helga was there, having followed the men at a distance. She let out a small cry at the sight of Anne's wounds and immediately began tearing strips from her petticoat to make bandages. "We heard the shooting," Olaf said, his voice choked with emotion as Helga tended to Anne's arm and shoulder. "It went on for so long. Jedediah came to my door. He said a war had started, and that if we let Kane finish you, our homes would be next. I was a coward, and I was afraid. To leave you alone, can you ever forgive me? And looked at the man, at his tear-streaked, soot-stained face. She saw not the coward who had turned her away, but the man who had faced his fear and fired the shot that had saved her life. She reached out with her good hand and placed it on his arm. "There's nothing to forgive, Olaf," she said, her voice weak but clear. "You came." Jedediah Kane approached, his hat in his hands, his withered face filled with a respect so deep it was almost reverence. "Ma'am," he said, the word holding a new weight. We all underestimated you. What you did here, it's the stuff of legends." He looked around at the dead outlaws, then at the burning ruins. "You lost your home defending it. The house is gone," and whispered, the reality of it finally settling in, a cold, heavy stone in her heart. "But the home is still here." She looked at the land, her land, now consecrated by blood and fire. By mid-morning, the news had reached Progress. A wagon arrived carrying a stunned-looking Sheriff Miller and a town doctor. Miller's jaw went slack as he took in the scene. He saw the dozen-plus bodies of Kane's notorious gang. He saw the smoldering ruins of the cabin. And he saw in Whitmore, bandaged and bloodied but unbroken, surrounded by the ranchers who had come to her aid. "I'll need to make a report," Miller stammered, looking helplessly at the dead outlaws. "You do that, Sheriff," Kane said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You write down how Mrs. Whitmore did the job you were too yellow-bellied to even consider. You write down how the decent folk of this valley had to handle things themselves. And then you ride on back to your comfortable office." Miller flushed, but said nothing. He had been judged and found wanting, not by a court of law, but by the community he was supposed to serve. His authority had been burned away in the same fire that had consumed Anne's home. The community that had once watched her with pity or doubt now rallied around her. The women brought food and water. The men, with a grim and silent understanding, began the grim task of dealing with the dead, loading the bodies onto a wagon to be taken to town and buried in a potter's field. Helga helped and sift through the cooling ashes near the cabin's foundation, searching for anything that might have survived. Miraculously, they found the cast-iron box where she kept her few valuables. Inside, blackened but intact, was the photograph of her and Thomas. She clutched it to her chest, the first tears she had allowed herself to shed tracking clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. As the sun began to set, the same time of day the siege had begun, her land was finally quiet. The bodies were gone. Her neighbors stood with her, their presence a silent promise of support. "You'll not be alone in this," and Jedediah Kane said, his voice firm. "We're going to rebuild. All of us. We'll have a new cabin up for you before the first snow." And looked at the faces around her, Svensson's, Kane, the other ranchers, and their wives. She had sought their help and been denied. But by refusing to break, by standing her ground when no one else would, she had done more than just defend her property. She had reminded them of who they were, of the bonds of courage and mutual obligation that were supposed to define the frontier. She had lost a house of logs, but in its place, she had forged a foundation of community, built on the ashes of her sacrifice and cemented with their newfound respect. Spring came to the high plains of Wyoming, a season of fierce and stubborn life. The snows melted, the creeks ran full and clear, and the prairie grasses, fertilized by the ashes of the fire, grew back a vibrant, impossible green. And on the gentle slope overlooking the creek, a new house rose from the foundations of the old. It was not built by one woman's hands, but by many. The cabin raising at the Whitmore homestead became the talk of the territory. Jedediah Kane organized the men, who came from ranches 50 miles away, bringing with them saws, axes, and wagons loaded with fresh-cut pine. Olaf Svensson, his shame now replaced by a fierce loyalty, worked the hardest of all, his hammer blows echoing from sunup to sundown. The women of the valley, led by Helga, kept a constant supply of hot food and coffee, turning the grim work of rebuilding into a celebration of community and survival. And was at the center of it all. She was no longer the object of pity or a damsel in distress. She was the architect, the commander. With a quiet, unshakable authority, she directed the work, her plans practical and efficient. The new house was similar to the old one, but it was stronger. The windows were strategically placed, the foundation was reinforced with stone, and the shutters were thick and heavy. It was a home built with the hard-won wisdom of a veteran. Her physical wounds healed, leaving scars that she bore with a quiet pride. But the deeper transformation was within. The grief for Thomas was still there, a constant, gentle ache. But it was no longer the defining feature of her existence. Her stand had given her a new purpose. She was no longer just the keeper of his memory, she was the architect of her own legacy. The story of the widow's last stand spread across the territory, carried by travelers and itinerant preachers. It became a campfire tale, a legend that grew with each telling. They called her the Widow of Whitmore Creek, a woman who had faced down Silas Kane's entire gang and won. Outlaws and road agents began to give her stretch of land a wide berth. The law, embodied by a newly elected and far more determined sheriff, found a new respect for the settlers of the valley. Ann's private war had brought a public peace. One cool evening, as the last of the roof beams were being set in place, Ann stood on her new porch, looking out at the land. The sun was setting, just as it had on that terrible day, but now the colors in the sky spoke not of blood and fire, but of peace and promise. Olaf and Jedediah sat with her, sharing a cup of coffee. "It's a good house," and Jedediah said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "A strong house." "It's our house," Olaf added quietly, looking at her with gratitude. Ann nodded, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. She had her home back. More than that, she had a place. She was no longer a solitary woman on an isolated homestead. She was the heart of a community that she herself had forged in the crucible of her own courage. Later that night, alone in the shell of her new home, she took out the smoke-stained photograph of her and Thomas. She placed it on the freshly cut mantelpiece. "We did it, Thomas," she whispered to the smiling image. "We kept the dream alive." But she knew, in her heart, that it was no longer just his dream. It was hers now, bought and paid for. It was a dream not of a peaceful life given, but of a purposeful life earned. And so our tale comes to a close. As you pull your blanket tighter and watch the embers of our own campfire die down, remember the story of Ann Whitmore. Remember that the spirit of the West is not just in the swagger of the gunslinger or the ambition of the cattle baron. It is in the unyielding strength of a single heart, the quiet courage of a woman who, when faced with the abyss, refused to back down. She stood her ground, fought for her home, and in the ashes of her old life, built a legend that would forever echo on the Wyoming wind.